And now to round out our session, please welcome Steve Willis, engineer, innovator, and author of Fairhaven, a novel of climate optimism. Steve co founded Herculean Climate Solutions to identify the multi million ton interventions needed to tackle the climate crisis. He values fiction as a tool to help people visualize where we're headed and what it might take to get there, blending real world projects with storytelling to make large scale solutions feel tangible and relatable. So let's welcome him to the stage. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Now for something completely different, as they say. Who has the clicker? Ah, here we go. So I'm Steve Willis. Nice to see you all. And I'm the author of a climate fiction novel called Fairhaven, a novel of climate optimism. And optimism is a word that's been shuffled around a bit here. And for me, the word optimism means persistence, determination, and grit. So getting on with it. Optimism is the thing you have when you've been knocked down and you decide to get up and carry on. So can a good story help us see a better future? So storytelling is the thing that humans do. We are the human storytellers. So which one of the largest things that we consume is narratives. So I'm a chemical engineer, so not a natural writer by any means. And I've been living in Malaysia for the last 18 years. And during that time, I've been doing environmental work for the oil and gas companies, and I'm still doing that. I have a very broad industrial background. So, although I have a scientific origin, I'm also a practicing engineer, and I've been to the oil platforms in these super remote but very interesting places. 10 years ago or so, we set up Herculean Climate Solutions to find the multi-million ton solutions. If we're going to actually fix the climate crisis, we need to find all these great big, huge industries, do them, set them up, and get them going. And they need to be done at an industrial scale. So we got into this problem at an industrial scale. If we're going to get out of it, it has to be at an industrial scale. So Fairhaven is our first novel, and we're planning to write about 5. So climate fiction. Climate fiction is looking into the near future, speculative fiction, and imagining a future where there is the climate is front and center, and it's the main part of the story. And one of the things that is often said said amongst the writing communities is that if you're not writing about the climate in fiction, what you're writing is fantasy. It's no longer bearing any resemblance to what's actually happening. So all stories should be climate fiction. So why climate fiction? And in fact, why fiction at all? So I'm sure you recognize some of these characters here. George Lucas. You can't do it unless you can imagine it. So if you're going to get to a place, you need to know where you're going. Kind of follows. So you can't do it if you imagine it. I can't imagine it. And why optimism? So Henry Ford is a very controversial character, so you can't use all of his quotes, but I quite like this one. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. So you need to bear in mind, if you give up, you have actively chosen to fail. So you've removed yourself from the possibility of a success. So there's lots of fiction written about the climate and environment already, and the vast majority of it is deeply dystopian. So of these, Neil Stephenson's Termination Shock is actually the more optimistic one, and it's still describing a very grim situation. There's a lot in this slide, so I'll only talk about the middle here. So fiction impacts real life, and you've all got a Star Trek communicator in your pocket. So the things that are written into fiction do become real with time, or sometimes. And it really helps people to understand what's coming if they've seen it already in fiction. And I know you all write reports and so on, and it's fabulous work, but the brutal reality is that the bulk of society, the ones that we will ultimately have to engage with, and I think I've heard the word engage said about 20 times already today. So how are we going to engage with the wider population? Ordinary people don't read white papers. or reports. And to be brutally honest, they don't read books anymore either. So our ultimate goal is to get the whole lot onto Netflix. So write a series that can eventually be produced by Netflix to be the opposite of Don't Look Up. So half a billion people have seen Don't Look Up and seen how depressing and hopeless it all is. If we can make a series which is the opposite and encourage them to, get off the sofa, stop eating donuts, and actually do something, we might make some progress. So to do that, we wrote a novel of climate optimism. So Fairhaven, a novel of climate optimism. And so like the fiction and this slide I took from a climate governance meeting that I was at a couple of weeks ago. And I asked the attendees there to list films and TV shows that showed the future as they imagined it. So just for a moment, think about, what show do you watch or film that you've seen shows the future as you imagine it? And then secondly, what does Hollywood think? So this was the slide that came from that. And you can see we have Mad Max and The Day After Tomorrow, Terminator, Walking Dead, Train to Busan. I mean, I don't want to live with that guy. But some of these stories are great, but there's not a single optimistic one amongst them. And last year, as you're all scientists, which may be slightly too small to see, but as you're all scientists, last year I got a list of 50 films about utopias and dystopias, so future-facing films. And so does the thing work here? There we go. So it looks at utopia and dystopia and plausibility on two axes. And in the top corner, we have Mad Max. And by Mad Max, I mean Road Warrior. So Mel Gibson before he went completely off the rails. So Mad Max is an interesting film, but it's a lousy lifestyle choice. I don't want to live there. It's really interesting. So it's deeply dystopian, and from where we are today, it's really rather plausible, I'm afraid to say. On the dystopian side over here, we have Walking Dead and Snowpiercer. So, very dystopian stories, but completely implausible, because we're never going to have zombies because they don't actually exist. But that evolutionary niche will be filled by angry West Texans with guns. So on this side, the implausible utopias, we have Star Trek. We'd all love to live in Star Trek, space communism and everything with the energy mass transfer and so on. That would be lovely. But to get to that point, you have to go through their Third World War. So again, a poor set of choices. And in this corner, where we have somewhat plausible futures that don't suck, you have Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, and the book that we chose to write in that space. And one of the things I find really quite shocking is that the writers of the world have only shown doom or things that can't work. They haven't taken the effort to find a future that we do actually want to aim for. And in an odd way, it's the responsibility not of engineers and scientists as a community, but for the creatives as a community to find the stuff that needs to be in that space. So Fairhaven is a story. It follows the career of a young Malaysian engineer, and she's called Grace Chan, and she works on a massive climate adaptation project, and all fictional still. And as a character, she suffers from crippling climate anxiety. So briefly mentioned yesterday, and climate anger, and climate grief, and climate despair. And as a topic, I think we need to talk about it more together. How do we experience that in our real lived lives, and how do we support one another better? Because a lot of us have all looked down that well, and are we keeping an eye on one another? I think we should maybe make a more positive focus to do that. So she becomes an unexpected, very reluctant influencer which opens a political doorway. So this is a way of opening narratives and allowing a whole bunch of interesting things to happen. So within Fairhaven, the first book, the focus on this and all of the other stories we write is about scale. So what you're trying to do is do really, really big things, which do millions and ultimately billions of tons of CO2. So from our innovation heritage, our question would always be, if you're looking at a project, will it do, sorry, the first question was always, will it work? Will it do 1 million tons and is it a negative emission? But all of these things need to crank up eventually to become gigaton solutions. We need gigaton solutions. And my, back of my mind comment about a lot of the things get said is, how many tons does that do then? We need to be thinking about the tons. So within Fairhaven, there's some stuff about climate adaptation and repairing the ocean and refreezing the Arctic. So we'll come to that in a moment. And in the sequel, we're looking at how to deal with sea level rise when it's 1 meter, 2 meters. How do you take down the stuff in Florida that's going to be flooded? Who's going to do that work? How is it physically going to be done? And then we also look at managing forest fires, the big CO2 sequestration project. So for as our startup, we were looking at CO2 mineralization projects. So this is a very personal piece of experience, but it makes you realize when you're working through the fiction that actually it's only millions of tons. The forest fires are billions of tons, and there's like 3 orders of magnitude, 4 orders of magnitude between what's taking place and what you're trying to do. And the orders of magnitude are an important piece of this. So we spend, as we're assembling these stories, we're trying to imagine solutions to the largest problems. How do you manage global forest fires such that the carbon in the brash goes into the ground rather than the atmosphere, and you manage the soils rather than lose them? And how do you imagine doing that? And as a narrative exercise and exploration, it's quite fun, and working on it's very interesting. But every now and again you surface and you think, oh god, that's a 5 gigaton project, that, isn't it? So going back to Fairhaven itself, it's set in Penang. And in Penang in 2017, it flooded. And Penang floods on a regular basis. And the brutal reality is that, with 1 meter or 2 of sea level rise, Penang will be lost. So why have we used Penang as a subject? Now, geographically, it's very unusual. It's got great food, and it'd be great for a Netflix series. So that's partly why it was chosen. But geographically, all of this area is, a lot of Southeast Asia is very vulnerable to sea level rise. So although this is set to 5 meters, a huge chunk of South Vietnam will be lost. A great big chunk of southern China will be lost. And in terms of the cities, Bangkok and Jakarta will no longer function. Singapore might struggle to continue to exist, and so on. So you've got this huge challenge, which is totally not being addressed. But there's great heritage in fixing the sea level rise, and our ultimate goal would be, in the fiction, would be to build a dike between the island and the mainland, recover the land, and have a place that you can defend for 200 years. So it's designed to be flooded when it floods, but it's also designed to be defended for a couple of 100 years. The other big solution we have is ocean orchards, or sea orchards, as we call it here. And in the picture on the left is a picture I took about 20 years ago from throwing one small piece of bread from an oil rig. And many of you won't know that the oil platforms are the most abundant marine habitats in the world. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that they are exclusion zones. They have exclusion zones, and they're multi-story environments, and they're incredibly abundant, really quite remarkable. And the third big solution we talk about in the story is refreezing the Arctic. So as the Arctic Reflections and Real Ice guys were saying, our proposal within the story is to have small icebreakers pushing into thin ice, And again, these are oil industry boats. These are offshore supply vessels hardened for ice and with a bit of a heater because it's going to be quite cold up there. And you send them up into the thin ice and pump seawater using the existing firefighting pumps to pump seawater onto thin ice to make it into thick ice. And they just keep going. And you have a whole line of them like combine harvesters working their way across a large area to make a very large volume of thickened ice. And the interesting part of this, of course, is that it's oil industry adjacent. So they have these boats already. There's actually 500 of them in cold stack available. Can you believe that? And they also have the crews and they also have the logistics and they can manage operation in a high hazard environment. An NGO can't do that, So it's very oil industry adjacent. And as we've been writing the stories, all of these other ideas appear. So this is the one that's written in this particular book. The next one uses zeppelins and submerged pumps to thicken ice. And then the next piece after that uses nuclear power from submarines to do a different job. And the third one uses static equipment in flowing ice to fold and roll the ice to make new leads. And using fiction as a modeling tool to do that is fascinating because it's like you've got your two little characters and they've got 8 years out already and they're faced with this challenge and you're looking over their little shoulders and thinking, what are they going to do now? What can they actually physically do at this point? And all of these additional ideas appear. So I would recommend storytelling to you as a brainstorming technique because it's really opened some great doors for me. So our message is we need to imagine and act on a big scale, and we need to share that with the wider population. So engagement is one of the critical things we've talked about today, and we need to engage with the bulk population through the media that they use, not by some other means, but on the telly, or through a podcast or something, but using a mechanism that they use already. And then the last one is it's not over. One thing that has really come apparent to me that there's lots of things we can still do. So this is a request. We're still writing the sequel, so we want to get out to 2062. Fairhaven itself ends in 2042. And I want to build a stack of really big solutions where we get to 2062 and we've kind of mostly fixed most of it. And, it's still difficult and there's a lot to do, but it's in hand. We're not in the position that we are today. And I would love to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your opinions, things that we should be writing into the stories, which give us that chance to get there. If I gave you my magic wand and you could, get $10 billion from the Pope and do whatever it was you wanted to do, what is that thing? I really want to know that. So I'm around this afternoon and this evening. So if anybody wants to meet up for a chat, that'd be great. And I can be reached by emails and stuff. We've written 3 books so far. We've got 4 more to go. And that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let's have some questions.
Thanks, Steve. I'm wondering, I'm not so intrigued about the fictional ideas, but I'm very intrigued by your background with the oil industry. And it strikes me that the oil industry is really the key, or could be the key, if it could be repurposed to do some of these things. They have the equipment, they have the people, they have the money, they have the know-how in many ways, and operating in the Arctic and other regions. Could you make any suggestions on how to get the oil industry that works in the Arctic and elsewhere to contribute to solutions instead of the problem?
Yeah, I know a lot of guys in the oil industry and have for a long time. And the guy that I'm helping at the moment. When I go into the office, it's really quite funny because I stand beside him and he says to the people around him, "Watch out for Steve. He thinks the world is going to end." So there's like this, blokey piss take kind of thing taking place. And then 2 minutes later, he says, "That person there, you need to speak to them about doing the rigs to reefs. And, and that one there, that's the guy that we need to get to do the mangrove project. So he's got this schizophrenia thing going on where he is two characters, interestingly, and using like the storytelling as imagining him as a character in a book, it kind of simplifies who he is. You can understand him better, visualizing him as that. So he is the oil guy, and at the same time, he's also the guy trying to fix the problem. And given the right opportunity, so particularly with like the rigs to reef stuff, they want to do the blue carbon. They've committed to making all of these impossible promises. And if he can do a load of blue carbon, he will actually, love to do that. So, keep pressing, I think. Who do you know?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the approach you brought to this. Two quick questions. One, I'm curious how you think about the different kinds of value provided by fiction that is fundamentally about climate change, says climate optimism on the cover, things like Ministry for the Future, versus fiction that is fundamentally about other things that features climate change. I don't have a good example of this, maybe The Wind-Up Girl. Obviously, you need all and both. I'm curious how you thinking about this and how you approach this project. And then secondly, just curious if you chat with people in Malaysia, governments, other people around, and how they respond to the framing you've brought to this book.
Yeah. So there's a climate fiction writers league. Of course there is, isn't there? And they're encouraging writers to include anything to do with climate in all of the things that they write, even the fantasy, so try and weave it in all the time, just to like quietly make it a normal subject to talk about, so that there is a push to do that. Writing positive outcome climate fiction is difficult for people because the writers are, almost all of them have done English literature. So they have none of the technical background in order to be able to write a story that isn't about people in disastrous situations, because they can't imagine the technology in order to get out of that hole. So that's that one. And how's things in Malaysia? Well, it's interesting and too long to describe, but there's some massive opportunities there. So the big rigs to reefs one, they've got hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of seabed that's been trashed by trawling, and we can get on with this, very quickly. There's existing small rigs to reefs projects. We can extend them, get those through the gate relatively quickly.
Yeah, Steve, brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. I was going to mention The Wind-Up Girl as well. I think that's really worth a read for everybody. I was also going to say it should be honourable mention to Robert Llewellyn and News from Gardenia, if you haven't heard of that, as in the...
Sorry, can you make it a bit louder?
Robert Llewellyn, News from Gardenia, as being an example of a utopian climate novel. The thing I was going to ask was, when you're imagining these scenarios in your novels, is it because, as I mentioned to you the other night, when like my idea for Sky Scroll came out of an unwritten novel that I kind of wrote a concept for. So are you getting ideas from imagining these future scenarios, and coming up with possible solutions for them that haven't come up here yet?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I'm an engineer, and our original scope was to find 1,000 ways to do 1 million tons of capture or avoidance or sequestration or whatever it is you can do with carbon. So they're like appallingly arrogant, sort of like, well, let's see if we can find a load of them. And we had accidentally found 2 before starting this work, So our list of potential solutions is about 150 long of things that would probably work. And I've found that writing a story, writing a chapter, you've got your couple of little characters, and as you're working them, a whole new solution appears from the scenario. It's amazing, it really, really revealing.
Depending on whom you ask, some people will say, solving CO2 is the solution, or CO2 is just a symptom of the wider inequality, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm not going to judge either of these positions, but I was curious to what extent sort of wider, not directly climate-related societal issues also feature in your novels, or whether you have plans to include them.
Can we keep the question,
Yep.
the answer as brief as possible, please?
Sorry
Can
again.
we keep the answer as brief as possible, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The hard one is finance. How do we make the, paraphrasing, it's the economy stupid. So if we're going to get to 2062 in a decent livable world, we have to kind of keep the economy kind of going in some usable form all the way out to that. You can't destroy capitalism because then you go straight to the Mad Max, sequel. So there's all of this puzzle to do of how you make the financial system work. So we have several things written in the story that do that. But if anybody has particularly an informed opinion, I would love to speak to them about it. So, yeah. Absolutely. So thank you very much.